I wanted to, first of all, have people ask questions, and then if you wanted, I can narrate a hadith to you, and then you guys can all have a chain of transmission back to the Prophet. So if you want that, I can do it. Might get a little boring. There's a lot of names. But if it's something you want, I'd be happy to do it. It's a tradition for scholars to do this. And but I think first I'll answer questions, because I don't want to take up time without answering questions that I may have generated. Yes? Go ahead.
What are the main differences between the Sahih al-Bukhari and the Sahih Muslim? What distinguishes one from the other? Because it's very common to hear that Bukhari is much more authentic than Muslim. So what things did Bukhari do in collecting hadith that maybe Muslim didn't necessarily do?
So the question is, what are the differences between Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim? There's two very important differences. Remember, Muslim was a student of al-Bukhari, right? One of the main differences is the nature of the books. Sahih al-Bukhari is kind of the gospel according to Bukhari. This is his vision of Islamic law and dogma. He gives you a chapter. He tells you, this is the title of the chapter. This is what you should understand from the chapter. The hadith that I'm giving you as my evidence. It's almost like his version of Islam, right? Muslim's book is much more of almost a reference, in the sense that Muslim will give you a chapter that's saying, these are the things that if they pass in front of you, will break your prayer. It's a dog or a donkey, for example, or someone walking too close in front of you. The next chapter will be, here are hadiths that tell you that nothing that passes in front of you will break your prayer. So, I mean, if you're reading the book, it doesn't really help you understand how to pray, because you have two chapters that contradict one another. Because what Muslim is saying is, I'm just giving you hadiths that I think are authentic. How you put them together is the business of a jurist, right? So, let's say in the Sunan of at-Tirmidhi, you have a chapter that says, hadiths that tell you you can drink standing up. The next chapter is hadiths that the Prophet prohibited people from drinking standing up. So how do you, as a jurist, what do? Well, you say, the Prophet, we know that he drank standing up, so it was allowed, but we have these reports of him saying you shouldn't do it, so it's probably makruh. It's allowed, but it's not recommended, right? So this is the difference between Bukhari and Muslim's books, in terms of their actual format. The difference in their methodologies is very specific scholarly issue. In general, Muslim scholars believe that Bukhari required everybody in his chain of transmission to have met their teacher at least once. Let me rephrase that. He required there be evidence that he met his teacher or she met her teacher at least once. So there has to be some instance, some hadith, where, let's say, Uthman says, Jonathan Brown told me, I heard him say, or he narrated to me. Everything else might be Jonathan Brown said. But when someone says Jonathan Brown said, that doesn't mean they actually heard me say it. It means maybe they heard somebody else attribute it to me. Or they read it in the newspaper, right? It doesn't mean they actually had to hear it from me. What Bukhari says is, we have to know that at least once in his life, this student had to have actually met his teacher. That way we know that, in general, the different hadiths that they transmit from one another took place from face-to-face transmission. Muslim, in his Sahih, he says, this is really unrealistic because there's so many relationships between transmitters that we use all the time. For example, Urwa ibn Zubair from Aisha. Right? So Urwa ibn Zubair, the son of Abdullah ibn Zubair, was basically adopted by Aisha. But she sort of adopted him because he was her niece. He was her nephew by his mother. So she kind of adopted him almost as a child. And Urwa ibn Zubair spent tons of time with her. But, and I think, I don't want to misquote Muslim, I think this is the case. If I'm wrong, then forgive me, someone can check this up. I think Muslim says, there's never actually an instance where Urwa ibn Zubair says, I heard Aisha say. He says, Aisha said. Now, we assume, because he spent so much time with her, that he heard this from her in person. But if we look at that methodology that Bukhari is using, it's tough to actually prove that he heard this from her. So what he's trying to do is he's saying Bukhari's, and he never actually mentions al-Bukhari. Maybe it's because he's his teacher, he doesn't want to be disrespectful. Maybe it was that Bukhari never thought that. But he says, I don't agree with this because basically if we apply this rule, then all these chains of transmission that we know are authentic by our methodology, we'd actually have to reject them. It's too demanding. So that's the big difference between Bukhari and Muslim. There's a couple of other differences. Bukhari generally doesn't take from, Muslim doesn't take from, what was I say, Muhammad? Ikrimah, the Mawla, the bondsman of Abdullah bin al-Abbas, because he thinks that Ikrimah is a Kharijite, whereas Bukhari doesn't mind taking from Ikrimah. There's a couple of other disagreements. Muslim takes from Marwan ibn al-Hakam. Bukhari does not take from Marwan ibn al-Hakam. He was sort of a controversial figure who was maybe not the best Muslim. He was a successor, not a companion of the Prophet. Does that answer the question? Okay. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that one of the ways to legitimize or accept the hadith if it's widespread, if there's widespread practice in a certain community. Was there a distinction made whether there's a certain generation that the practice was widespread in, or if it's a certain region like Medina, as opposed to newer communities that they were coming in the fold of Islam?
This is a good question. The question is, when we talk about communal practice, sort of authenticating hadith, is there any limit on that? Yes, obviously, if today all Muslims are, I don't know, let's say all Muslims are dishonest and, objectionable or something, that doesn't mean that there's a hadith that says be dishonest and objectionable, that's authentic. Right? So, clearly Muslim practice today does not have the authority that it had the time of the Prophet, or the early generations of Muslims. In addition to which, I don't think you're going to have any agreement amongst Muslims nowadays that you didn't have in the early period. So when people talk about that communal practice validating a hadith, it's usually you're talking about the first couple of generations of Islam. It just doesn't happen after that. It's not going to be realistic. For someone like Malik ibn Anas, he was from Medina, he felt that the practice of the people of Medina reflected the sunnah of the Prophet. So he felt that the communal practice of Medina was particularly authoritative. These were the people whom the Prophet had taught Islam firsthand. And they had taught their children Islam as they learned it from the Prophet. So when Malik says, I pray with my hands down at my side, because this is how we pray in Medina, his attitude is, who cares if someone comes from Kufa or from Syria telling me that I have to have my hands like this? I've lived here my whole